Hello, this is not John T. Rhapsodies, purveyor of awesome, old-school audio stories. Mr. Rhapsodies has asked me to read his own original stories, all in the old-school style. And so, let us together hear the words of old. A Parable of Weeds. Chapter 1. The Sowing. On an early spring afternoon in the year of our Lord 1871, Jacob Smith surveyed the freshly ploughed field he and his tough and tired mule, Jezebel, had just finished. She flicked at flies with her wearied tail, her breath slowing down as she rested. In Jacob's solitude, the mule had become what one might call a somewhat friend. But the friendship was often not mutual, her notorious Old Testament name betraying her character. The mule was not the only one who knew hardship. Jacob's hands had known dirt and toil very well and were tough and cracked like the bark of the old oaks that surrounded his field. His back was also no stranger to hard work. It pained him some, but he was still able to endure it. Oil of wintergreen seemed to give some relief to his sore muscles, and the mule's too. Jacob was also acquainted with sorrow. His wife Sarah had shed her mortal coil about 5 years ago, likely from a heart broken, when she finally accepted that their only son, James, would never return from the war, which was anything but civil. There had been no word, no letters, no graveside, and no tombstone. There was only the ache of an empty place at the table and in their hearts, and it was a burden that Sarah simply could not bear on this earth. "You can get some rest now," Jacob said to his cantankerous mule as they turned toward the barn. "Tomorrow we'll sow the corn." He reached to gently scratch her head between her tall ears, but she shook it off with snorting protests. Some weeks later, when the early morning fog still hung low and thick upon the earth, Jacob surveyed his field once again. The corn had vigorously climbed over a foot already, and he could see it breaking through the fog. All appeared to be going the way corn was supposed to go. He smiled and nodded. Jacob was a man whose speech was spare, like a man who knew his time was brief and his words were fewer still. His faith had grown slowly but surely over time, though not without storms and droughts, hills and valleys. At this season of his life, Jacob felt a good measure of peace after all and everything. But that peace would be encroached upon for a time, and it began with the weeds. They were simple enough at first. Jacob barely noticed them as he saw them sprout among the corn. He figured they must have come from stray seeds blown by the wind or dropped by passing birds, perhaps. But as the sun and the moon continued to trade places, the weeds twisted and tangled among the corn with a speed and vigor that was confounding. The taller they grew, the more they looked like corn, but prettier in a subtle sort of way. Stranger still, the weeds grew faster overnight instead of the other way around, as if the weeds craved the darkness rather than the light. One early evening, as the sun had just begun to move west to another part of the world making way for the moon, Jacob espied visitors walking on the edge of his field toward him, a man with a woman and 2 dogs trailing behind. The man introduced himself as Hargrave as he held out his hand. Jacob took the hand and shook it, noticing it was strong and certain, but a little colder than it should have been. Hargrave seemed friendly enough. He was a man of middle years and was dressed in faded clothes and a wide-brimmed hat. The woman stood pale and thin a few feet behind, gazing upon the ground with a wry smile. The dogs were quiet, serious, and dignified. They looked like some sort of wolves, their fur dark as soot and their eyes sharp with wisdom. "I've come from out of town," Hargrave said happily. Jacob found it peculiar that the man said "I" instead of "we," and that he didn't introduce his wife or his dogs as a man normally would. "I have moved into the cabin on the old Wilson place," Hargrave continued. Do you know it? Jacob nodded, since he knew the place well enough. The place had been abandoned for years, since old man Wilson had died with no discernible heirs. The small cabin had been weathered by time and neglect, the fields overgrown and fallow. I've decided to make a go of it here, Hargrave smiled. I thought that since we're neighbours, and since we're supposed to be neighbourly, I'd come over and offer my help, since it's too late for me to begin planting this year. I've worked the land some in my day. Hargrave surveyed Jacob's corn crop and shook his head. He said, Looks like you've got some weeds. Might be I could lend a hand. Jacob looked at the pretty but invasive weeds and hesitated in his response. Hargrave stepped forward instead of waiting for a reply, his smile big and wide. You need to pull those weeds, Jacob, Hargrave said. If you don't, they'll choke your crops for sure and you'll lose everything. Yes, sir, it would be best to pull them. The words were simple and made sense, but there was something in Hargrave's voice, something in his gaze, that unsettled Jacob. He had known men like Hargrave before, slick and silver-tongued, clever with speech but hollow at the core. At the same time, Jacob had no solid reason to distrust him outright. I've been working this land my whole life, Jacob said, his voice steady. But I've never seen anything like these weeds. They don't look or act like regular weeds. They look so much like the corn, it's a little hard to tell the difference. Hargrave laughed softly and smiled as he said, Friend, there's no such thing as a weed that doesn't act or look like a weed. They'll choke your corn if you let them keep growing. You ought to pull them all. There was something odd about this man's insistence on pulling the weeds, and it gnawed at Jacob. He couldn't argue with the need to pull the weeds, but he didn't want to admit that to the stranger. Thanks for the offer, Jacob said, but I reckon I'll tend to this field like I always have. Good luck to you at the Wilson place. And with that, Hargrave nodded with a smile and turned toward the Wilson place, his silent wife and big dogs following. Jacob bent down, untangled a weed from a corn stalk, and pulled it from the earth carefully. It was not easy. Then he pulled another, and another. He continued untangling and pulling until the sweat dripped from his brow into the soil, and it was too dark to see. Day after day, Jacob untangled and pulled weeds. And every day or two, his new neighbor would come over to give counsel with his dogs trailing behind him, sometimes with his wife and sometimes not. You really need to pull those weeds every day, friend, Hargrave would say, his voice wise and soothing. If you don't, they will take over. Jacob's hands bled through his gloves from the constant pulling, his muscles aching in new ways. Hargrave's words echoed in his mind. Jacob agreed that the weeds had to go and that he needed to keep pulling until the job was done. And so Jacob continued to untangle and pull the weeds. His muscles ached enough that he went through his entire bottle of wintergreen oil with none left for the mule. He even stopped going to church as the weeds consumed him. Each night Jacob stayed out late, long after the sun sank below the horizon, pulling weeds by lamplight. But no matter how many he pulled, he never seemed to make any progress. He wondered if the weeds and the land itself were conspiring against him. One Sunday afternoon, Jacob saw Preacher Timothy riding over on his old grey horse. Jacob was in the cornfield on his knees, untangling and pulling weeds. Hey there, brother Jacob, Preacher Timothy said. We haven't seen you in a while. Is there something wrong? Jacob paused from pulling and wiped his brow. These weeds, preacher, I've got to pull them or they'll ruin my corn. The preacher stepped closer, his boots crunching the dirt. He peered down at the strange weeds, his face furrowing. I've never seen weeds like that before, Preacher Timothy said. They sure are peculiar. They look just like the corn, but a little different, and look at how tangled they are with the corn. I've got to get them out, Jacob repeated as he continued pulling. Don't you agree? The preacher took off his hat and scratched his head a little as he ruminated upon his reply. Our Lord's parable of the tares comes to mind, Preacher Timothy said. Tares is another word for weeds, you know. The preacher waited for some kind of response of recognition from Jacob, but received none as Jacob continued frantically to pull weeds. There was a farmer who sowed good wheat seed in his field, Preacher Timothy continued. While the farmer slept one night, an enemy sowed some darnel seeds among his wheat. Darnel looks just like wheat in both seed and plant, and is poisonous. As they grew, the field hands wanted to pull the weeds, but the farmer told them to leave them be, or they might harm the wheat too. The farmer said to let the darnel and the wheat grow together till harvest, and then, at harvest time, the reapers could cut them both and bind them into bundles and place the wheat bundles in the barn, and then burn the darnel bundles. After a few moments of silence, Jacob slowed his pace, but continued pulling weeds. The preacher continued. Some people think the parable is about the church, others about the world in general. Either way, the idea is that the church and the world have a mix of real believers and counterfeit believers that seem like the real thing but aren't. And though it's difficult for men to do something about it, it will all be sorted out by God at the end times. Another thing I get from the parable is that just because there are counterfeits doesn't mean the real ones aren't real. If they weren't real and valuable, then why would anyone want to counterfeit them? Preacher Timothy paused for a moment as he watched Jacob pull the weeds, though at a slower pace. Then he added, Normally, I wouldn't say this parable means that farmers should never pull weeds. But in this case, since those weeds in your field look just like your corn and have tangled among them, seems like you have a similar situation with the tares and the wheat. Are you saying I should stop pulling these weeds? Jacob asked, peering up at the preacher, almost but not quite incredulous at the suggestion. I think in this case, yes, the preacher said. Let those weeds alone and pray that God will help you sort it all out. Yes, let both grow together until the harvest. You'll see. Jacob stopped pulling weeds and stood up. He had known Preacher Timothy for a long time, and God even longer. Jacob surveyed his cornfield, and then he took a deep breath. I reckon I'll stop pulling, Jacob said. We go back a long, long way, you and me. I thank you for your advice and concern. Deep in Jacob's heart, doubts lingered. Chapter 2. The Harvest. The days that followed hung heavy upon Jacob like an oversized pack filled with stones. Though he had resolved to stop pulling the strange but pretty weeds, he couldn't seem to shake the gnawing discomfort which came in waves. Whenever Jacob looked out the window or stepped outside, the weeds were there, standing tall and pretty among the corn. If he didn't know any better, he could swear he even saw his wife and son, Sarah and James, hiding in the cornfield one late summer evening, beckoning him to join them. But he knew that couldn't be so, not until the hereafter. Hargrave continued to come over every couple of days with his 2 dogs, sometimes with his silent and nameless wife behind them, and sometimes not. I still say you need to pull them, my friend, Hargrave said, smiling, as if his words were the only truth in the wide world. They're killing that corn. They're going to ruin you. Hargrave paused and then smiled his strange smile again as he said, I could help you. All you need to do is ask. Each time Hargrave spoke, Jacob felt his resolve waver. Sometimes he felt a desperate need to obey the advice, to do something on his own, anything that would make the weeds go away. But the words of Preacher Timothy echoed in his mind. Let both grow together until the harvest. You'll see. One morning, Jacob walked outside to feed and talk to Jezebel. He felt a calm he hadn't known for weeks. Hargrave, as Jacob had come to expect, was already there with his dogs. His wife with the quiet wry smile was with him this time, but as usual, she did not speak. "You're making a big mistake," Hargrave said, softly, his voice carrying the same manipulation. "You've got to pull them." But Jacob just shook his head and walked forth to tend to the corn, and not the weeds. He began inspecting the corn to make sure it was free from other problems and pests. He placed some scraps of rag soaked in coal oil here and there to fight against a few cutworms he saw, and the corn kept growing. The weeds kept growing too, but without any tending and always overnight. Jacob continued praying for the wherewithal to resist pulling the weeds and for God to protect his corn. One hot night, Jacob heard a strange noise coming from outside. He lit a lantern and walked around the house, then into the barn where he assured his restless mule who knew something was afoot. He heard a rustling among the corn and so ran over with his lantern. He saw two large dogs running off into the night in the direction of the Wilson place. He also heard a haunting giggle as if from a lady mimicking a little girl at play. Jacob walked to the spot where he saw the dogs exit and saw four things: paw prints, man prints, lady prints, and some strange little seeds on the ground. Jacob peered over a few of the seeds in his hand in the lamplight. They looked just like seed corn, with hues of yellow and orange, but with slightly black swirls. He now had a pretty good idea where the weeds came from. As Jacob walked back to the house by his lamplight, a verse came to mind. "Thy word is a lamp unto my feet, and light unto my path." He slept long and dreamed deep dreams. Jacob awoke the next morning to the sounds of men talking and laughing. He peered out the window and saw preacher Timothy with several men from church. They were rolling up their sleeves. Jacob brought boiled coffee to everyone, and they visited for a few moments. Then they all began the harvest together. First, they cut the cornstalks, along with the weeds, with corn knives and scythes. Then they made piles of the corn to harvest the ears later. After that, they bundled the strange, pretty weeds and threw them in a pile. The pile grew into a mound, then a hill, then almost a mountain. Preacher Timothy handed Jacob and the other men matches. They each circled the weed bundle mountain and set their respective sections aflame. The flames leapt faster and higher than seemed possible, stronger than any fire the men had ever seen. The heat was intense and otherworldly. It was as if the weeds were burning with a fury all their own, a bright but somehow dark fire that had no place in the natural world. Jacob stared at the flames as they crackled and popped. He thought of Hargrave and his strange ways, his twisted advice, and his empty words. Then he thought of God and God's word. When the last of the weeds had been burned, Jacob stood at the edge of the field, breathing the scent of the smoke and the earth. He thanked preacher Timothy and his friends. They all shook hands and parted ways. Jacob rode over to the old Wilson place to tell Hargrave that he knew what he had tried to do, but he had failed. Jezebel, Jacob's somewhat friend, took him down the old dirt road, past the Wilson fallow fields and toward the small cabin. As they got closer, something felt off. The wind seemed to hold its breath, and the old cabin stood silent in the late afternoon sun, as if it were waiting for him. Jacob tied the mule to a tree, not wanting her to wander around and get into trouble as she was apt to do. When he came to the door, he knocked once, then twice, but there was no answer. He peered through the window. There was no furniture, and the floors were dusty with no paw prints or footprints. Cobwebs spanned inside corners and elsewhere. He walked over to the water well. Jacob and others had placed a heavy stone over it to prevent children or animals from falling in after old man Wilson died. The stone appeared untouched. Everything looked like it had before Hargrave and his wife and dogs had moved there. It was as if they had never been there at all. Jacob and Jezebel rode back to his own place, the sun setting behind them. His fields were quiet now, the air still and pleasant. Hargrave was gone now, and the weeds, those pretty lies, those temptations to distrust God, and those things that had tried to choke his corn and his faith, they were gone now too. Preacher Timothy had said, "Let both grow together until the harvest. You'll see." Jacob did see. He got to church a little early the next morning with a story to tell.